And everyone should be introducing themselves with their pronouns. This creates an environment where transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conform people are not othered by having to share their pronouns simply in order to gain basic respect. There are a plethora of words people might use to describe their gender identity. Sex assigned at birth is plain and simply whoever's there when you're born, looking at you and saying this is a girl or this is a boy. I'd been bullied my entire life. There were an increasing number of stories in the news about young folks who took their lives because of bullying. This solidified that terrifying feeling for me, and I felt like, where's going to be next? Who's going to be next? Is it going to be somebody in my school? Is it going to be somebody that I know? Is it going to be one of my friends? Am I going to get to that point? Hey everyone, my name is Ryley, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs, and everyone should be introducing themselves with their pronouns, not just transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. Cisgender people should be introducing themselves with their pronouns too. Firstly, this creates an environment where transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people are not othered by having to share their pronouns simply in order to gain basic respect. Secondly, this shows us that we can't assume people's pronouns. If you are unfamiliar with a couple of words here, transgender refers to someone whose gender identity is not the same as their sex assigned at birth. Cisgender refers to someone whose gender identity does correlate with the sex that they are assigned at birth, i.e., if you are told that you are a girl and you know to yourself that you are a woman, you are cisgender. However, if you are told that you are a girl and you know that you are not a girl, you are transgender. We typically know or hear mostly about transgender men, folks who are told that they are girls who know themselves to be men, and transgender women, folks who are told that they are boys but know themselves to be women. There are a plethora of words people might use to describe their gender identity. I personally identify as non-binary, which to me means that I am not a woman or a man. And there are even a lot of words people might use to describe feelings and such similar to that, who they know themselves to be outside of this gender binary. Sex assigned at birth is plain and simply whoever's there when you're born, looking at you and saying this is a girl or this is a boy. But this other term, intersex, refers to folks who do not even neatly fit into these female and male binaries. Firstly, they're important to mention because when we do not talk about a group, they are othered, more easily discriminated against, and harassed. Secondly, they show us that binaries don't really exist anywhere. They are not a thing when it comes to biological sex. They are not a thing when it comes to gender. My story, I suppose, begins when I was around 16 years old. In high school, I started an anti-bullying organization called Stand Up, Speak Out. Personally, I'd been bullied my entire life, and it was only getting worse. My few friends also experienced a great deal of bullying, and at the time that I founded Stand Up, Speak Out, there were an increasing number of stories in the news about young folks who took their lives because of bullying. Each story seemed to get increasingly closer to where I lived, which made this even more terrifying for me. Right before I founded Stand Up Speak Out, there was a case in my state only about a couple hours away from where I lived. And this solidified that terrifying feeling for me. And I felt like, where's going to be next? Who's going to be next? Is it going to be somebody in my school? Is it going to be somebody that I know? Is it going to be one of my friends? Am I going to get to that point? Stand Up, Speak Out started with two main missions. The first was to educate children and adults about bullying and its effects. And the second was to create a space where kids knew that they were heard, they were seen, and they were cared about. The initial Facebook quickly became a website as well. And on the website, there was a space called the Creative Corner. Kids submitted their projects directly to me, and I posted them. And quickly, other kids began commenting on these projects and saying how much these stories and these projects helped them and allowed them to realize that they're not alone. And then the kids who had submitted these projects saw these comments, realized that they weren't alone, and being able to see that they helped others was incredibly empowering for them. Also, in high school, I was actively working to start a GSA. At the time, they were called Gay Straight Alliances. Now they're better known as Gender and Sexuality Alliances. My school was a middle and high school, technically. In the United States, it was grades 6 through 12 in the state of Massachusetts, in the area that I lived, and in that school. As I pushed and pushed with administration to start a GSA, showing them statistics about LGBTQ bullying, self-harm, and suicide, they finally started to agree to start a GSA, but they said that middle schoolers couldn't join. And again, I was shoving these statistics at them, trying to show them that middle schoolers needed this too. I found out years later that this was able to successfully be pushed through by a queer teacher who actually started at the school after I graduated. So that was really reassuring to hear that that did eventually happen. But for me, at that time, I found that Stand Up, Speak Out was becoming more of an intersectional activism and advocacy platform. It wasn't simply in the sense of the different types of bullying, physical, emotional, mental, and cyberbullying, but there was a lot of advocacy and education around the fact that societal oppression translates into bullying, which translates into harassment and discrimination and even violence. And it was really important to talk about groups that faced disparate treatment and to have that discussion in the bullying discussion. And LGBTQ folks became sort of like almost like my specialty. And I didn't understand why at the time, but fast forward to college, and at 18, I realized I was queer. At 21, I realized that I was non-binary. For me, I think that understanding my gender identity was more about language and accessibility to language. While I was in high school, I did know the word transgender and I knew what it meant, but I only really knew about transgender women and transgender men. And as someone who was assigned female, I knew I wasn't a man. So I wrote off a lot of what I would later learn to be dysphoria, extreme discomfort in my body, as stereotypical female body hate. And now, by the time I was 21, the word non-binary was shortly following the word genderqueer. And finally hearing that other people experience this, I don't really think I'm a girl, but I don't really think I'm a boy, that made sense to me. And I began to identify as non-binary. Throughout college, I also became deeply involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. The Mike Brown murder happened while I was in school, which was when Black Lives Matter really began taking to the streets. I was involved in protests. I was out on the streets, and I was friends with a lot of the Black organizers and leaders. And as a white person, they had asked me to marshal some of the protests, to stand on the outside of the crowd and make sure everyone stayed together, to also be able to look ahead and make sure that there was not any danger up ahead and be able to warn everyone if there was. And this was when I really learned a lot more about oppression and privilege in many more firsthand experiences. And I think that this is really important to talk about in regard to intersectionality, As a queer person, as a trans person, I face oppression, I face risks of violence, I face discrimination. But as a white person, I don't experience those things in relation to race. And it's really important to understand how that works. A lot of the LGBTQ community sometimes doesn't necessarily focus on that or even really understand it. A lot of white, queer, and or trans people are really set on how much oppression, discrimination, and violence they face because of their sexual orientation and or their gender identity. But no matter how queer you are, no matter how trans you are, if you are white, you are white. Your queerness, your transness, if you're white, you're probably still less at risk than any Black, brown, or Indigenous person. And Black trans women of color have the highest homicide rates. And this played also a lot into Stand Up, Speak Out, and all of my activism and advocacy work. I really did a lot of work around collaborating with other affinity groups. Many queer and trans spaces are very white, which creates this space that a lot of Black, brown, and Indigenous folks do not feel welcome in. And in a lot of Black, brown, and Indigenous spaces, as I know from my Black, brown, and Indigenous friends and the research, that there sometimes isn't as much of a welcoming environment for queer and trans people. So as a leader in queer and trans spaces, I did a lot of work trying to speak with other affinity groups and figure out how can we make our space more welcoming? How can you make your space more welcoming for folks who fall into multiple identities? Brought about a bit of cross-training initiatives specifically with Black Lives Matter as well. Throughout college and later law school, I was also very involved in political activism and advocacy in nonprofit and government spaces. I worked on, for years, and multiple sessions in our state house, multiple rounds of a bill to ban so-called conversion therapy. I began working on it in a state house internship where I actually ended up in the office of one of the co-sponsors and then sponsor of the bill during a later session. Actually, the session I had come in on. And I got to do research. I got to work a little bit on the language of the bill. Then in other government and nonprofit internships, I continued to push for the passage of this bill to ban so-called conversion therapy. I worked on a coalition that advocated for this bill and spoke both to the community as well as the government. The next bill I was deeply involved in was the Gender Marker X bill to put a non-binary gender marker on all state identification documents. Both of those bills did pass. In 2018, during the midterm elections, there was a ballot question in Massachusetts that was seeking to overturn transgender protections that had already been on the books in Massachusetts. Gender identity was listed as a protected class, and citizens in Massachusetts, if they got enough signatures on a petition, could get a question on the ballot. The question was strategically worded to be confusing. It was worded as, should we keep transgender protections, while one might expect the question to be, should we overturn transgender protections? So a no vote got rid of transgender rights. A yes vote kept them in place. So I produced an unsponsored independent ad encouraging folks to vote yes on 3. I worked with an intersectional group of transgender youth who shared their stories and shared what question 3 meant to them. I soon got a direct message on Twitter from Chase Strangio, a really amazing queer trans civil rights attorney in New York who happens to be friends with Laverne Cox. And they said, Laverne Cox wants to share your video. Can you send us the files? So Laverne Cox shared our ad. And then my youngest trans nugget, as I call her, she was 6 at the time. She and I got to meet Laverne Cox. And she was talking about the ballot question and voting and her story at this event that we were able to attend. And the hard work of everyone came together and we won. We kept transgender protections in Massachusetts. Following that massive project, I started the Won't Be Erased photo series in response to a memo from the United States federal government that was essentially seeking to remove a lot of language around transgender people and transgender identities and literally erase transgender people. The Won't Be Erased photo series included folks of all intersectional identities sharing quotes about themselves and then hashtag Won't Be Erased. More recently, I also began another photo series called the TGNC Real and Resilient Project. TGNC is shorthand for transgender, gender nonconforming. And the hashtag is Real and Resilient. And again, an intersectional group of folks are sharing quotes about themselves. So if you're interested, I would love to have you join. Below or somewhere near this video, we're going to have information on how you can contact me and information about the project, maybe even a couple examples of the project. All I need from you is a photo you'd like us to use, your name or a pseudonym or initials, whatever you're comfortable with, your age if you'd like to share, your pronouns, and your location if you'd like to share. Also, if you want to participate but want more anonymity, it can be like a back of the head photo, a shadow photo, a photo of your art, anything that works for you. And then a quote from you about yourself, about being real and resilient, whatever is on your heart right now, in your head right now, that's what we want to hear from you. And then I will edit the text onto the photo. This is really just about young people, but anybody, especially young queer and trans folks, seeing a queer and trans adult, knowing that their story matters, that they matter, knowing they are real and resilient.
Tell us what you think about this video, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.